Hi, everyone. My name is Cassandra Smith. I am the Director of Diversity and Inclusion in Trials for Janssen, and I'm honored and very privileged to lead the efforts. There are so many different lenses you could apply to diversity and inclusion in trials. Where we're starting is focusing on racial and ethnic diversity. I cannot stress enough how important intentional site selection is to achieving diversity and inclusion in clinical trials. And so we'll talk through that throughout the presentation. So before we do that, I wanted to start with three things that I wanted to point out here that are considerations that typically drive down the volume of underrepresented or minority populations in trials. Access to care and competing demands cannot be underestimated. Access is a really big barrier. People can't participate where they don't have access. And so, from an industry perspective, we need to ensure that we're increasing access. Now, if you were to split access, there are a lot of different levels and layers to that as well. But one thing that is pretty low hanging fruit that we're focusing our discussion on today is site selection and engaging the right sites to therefore provide additional access. Competing demands is really speaking more to some of the lifestyle factors and socioeconomic challenges that underrepresented groups may face. There are some things that we can do through the sites and clinical development operational practices to help with access. So a great example here is something like if you're dealing with a population and it's a working population, it may not be as easy for them to take off work or have vacation time to enroll into your study and participate. Might you consider as a site, extending your hours or having some flexibility? That all really leads up to access. The next thing that I wanted to address is the language and literacy barrier that we find sometimes in diverse populations. So language is key. You can't take away a person's ability to communicate. And I think oftentimes we think about in terms of, native tongue, English, Spanish, Russian, whatever that language is. But literacy also really feeds into this conversation because we can't assume that, everybody has a high degree of health literacy. In clinical research, we're talking about very complex science and, operational concepts that people have difficulty understanding. And so we have to keep that lens, especially if we're talking about trying to enroll diverse populations where there are some known lower literacy generally and specifically for health literacy. So two really important areas as well that are considerations that, again, sites certainly can help with, sponsors certainly can help with. And then the last one is around mistrust and misinformation. I would even maybe take it that next step further about clinical research or in clinical research in healthcare and in the pharma industry, in society. I think that this also can't be underestimated, but through engaging with the right sites and the right community organizations and maybe community ecosystem, mistrust is something that we can chip away at. There's a lot that we could discuss through each of these, different considerations, but I'm going to focus on the case for access really, because that really ties into a nice conversation around, access as related to site selection. I wanted to share a bit of data, and this is from our friends at Tufts. It's a look at underrepresentation in clinical trials, and again, focusing on racial and ethnic minorities. And where do we stand as an industry? What does this actually look like? And so you can look at the data here. It really speaks for itself. Black or African descent participants made up 5.4%, Asian participants made up 8.6%, Hispanic Latinx 7.2%, and then other race categories such as Alaskan Native, American Indian, et cetera, made up 3%. So if you total all of that up, that only comes to, just under 25% of participants being, racial or ethnic minorities. So the question is, which I think it's an obvious answer, what about the other, essentially 75%? That was made up of white participants. And so you can see it's not leveled up quite well. And if we look into the next two columns, disparity in number of therapeutic areas, what this is telling us is that, okay, they adjusted essentially for prevalence of disease in these particular populations to understand what does the disparity really look like? Because the column around trial participation and isolation, it tells a piece of the story, but I think you really do need to layer on well, what is the prevalence of, disease burden in these groups? And given that, do the numbers improve, or are they worse, or what does it look like? And so the middle column, looking across 18 therapeutic areas, you can see that the Black and African descent population was really underrepresented in clinical research by close to 54%. That's huge. Looking the next level down for the Asian population, there's an over-index of 118%. So that's great to see that there's a healthy dose of participation in the Asian population. But again, it goes kind of back down to a more grim story for the Hispanic, Latinx, and then, kind of the other category. We have some room and opportunity really to make improvements. And again, going back to the theme of our talk today around access, I think there's a really, unique opportunity that we can push this along and really get some better, improvement in the data. What role can sponsors play in this? There's a lot that we can do. There are absolutely some things that we as sponsors cannot do, or that it's very challenging, but there is still such a rich opportunity for us as sponsors to change the way we approach clinical development, the sites we select, how we interact, and really, are we making diversity and inclusion in trials a priority? And so I just have here a few items that we could think about from a sponsor perspective and examine, are we leaning into this? Is there opportunity? So they start with some of the things that are, I think, easiest up to some of the more difficult or involved, I guess I'll say, communities. So the first one around meeting patients where they are. So this is pretty simple, that we can take data-driven approaches to understand where patient burden is, and we can start to look for sites in those areas. That's not always how industry has worked. I know that there's a big move throughout our industry for data science and really taking more data-driven decisions as it relates to site selection. So this is one that if we apply the diversity lens on what we're already doing around data-driven decisions for site selection, it could be very powerful. Going another step forward is connecting with community healthcare professionals. And this is something that we as sponsors can do directly. We could also engage with trial sites that have existing relationships or are willing to build relationships with other community healthcare professionals. I think this is a really important one because there's a whole ecosystem of healthcare that patients navigate through. And it may not necessarily start or end really with the trial physician. So if the patient has an existing relationship with their community healthcare professional, their general professional, maybe even their specialist, but it's somebody they know that they're familiar with. Imagine if we were to leverage, those relationships to trial sites that are experienced, that we do typically go to for our research, and how powerful that connection could be, where patients now feel more comfortable because they know that the recommendation or referral is coming from a source that they're familiar with. The next one, which again, it's a increasingly more difficult. And what I mean by this is, industry sometimes, we know the sites that we know and we go to the sites that we go to. I think our lens of data science and applying that to site selection will greatly help here. But still, I think we should be intentional about finding sites that maybe we don't know, but who are out there and really ready to participate in research. So I'm not speaking about inexperienced sites in this particular case. I'm really talking more about just the sites that we don't know, and therefore, because we don't know them, we don't choose them. We have to change that thinking. And then finally, and this is a heavier lift, I fully recognize that and understand that, so we talked about expanding the site pool, but is there opportunity for us to actually help grow the site pool? And this is where I'm speaking more about the usage of novel healthcare professionals to gain experience. Are there opportunities where we could partner up with healthcare professionals that have an interest in research, maybe don't have the infrastructure or know-how to become sites, but with some help and guidance from us and from other colleagues that maybe are more experienced that we work with, could we then, kind of grow the number of sites that have access to the patients we're looking for research?